What is going on, everyone? My name is Jared Haas, and welcome to a special edition back in 1986. We are joined by a special guest. He is a NASCAR Hall of Fame Squier-Hall Award winner, none other than our Frontstretch own Steve Waid. Steve, how is everything going on your end, first of all?
Oh, doing very well. Thank you very much, Jared. Thanks for having me. Uh, Going along pretty well. Can't complain a single bit.
Well, perfect. Well, Steve, we got to first set the stage for you. Back in 1986, what were you doing?
Huh. Well, let me explain about 1986. No one could predict that it would be such a diversified, interesting season in terms of news. Okay, you never can. You just have to wait and see how the season plays out, and you take it from there. Well, 1986 was unique in several ways. Number one, it had perhaps the most controversial wreck in NASCAR history to that point between Dale Earnhardt and Darrell Waltrip at Richmond, just the second race of the year. Now, what makes that wreck rather, so controversial? Well, it's very simple. In a matter of minutes after that race is over, NASCAR pointed the finger at Earnhardt, not only fined him $5,000, made him post a bond and put him on probation for the rest of the year. That was unheard of. And it indicated that NASCAR was pretty much fed up with Earnhardt's style driving. But that's not all. There were statistical there were statistical controversies. In other words, NASCAR was not the best at keeping its own records for years and years and years. Didn't have the technology to do it, for one thing. And that created some doubts as the season went on. At Michigan, Richard Petty was supposed to make his 1,000th start. Problem was, when they looked back at the record, they could see that Richard had 21 starts in 1959, and all of a sudden, the record book showed he's got 22. Now, does that mean he's really starting his 1,000th race at Michigan or not? Okay, well, there's another matter when it came to NASCAR history and statistics. When Bobby Hillin won at Talladega that summer, he was declared the youngest driver ever to win a NASCAR race. He was just slightly older than 22 years old. Wrong. Digging back in the records, they found two drivers that had won races that were younger than Bobby. On the track, Jared, the most important thing that happened there, it was the rise of Tim Richmond. He won 7 races that season. Now, he was a young, dashingly handsome type of guy, and he was the kind of guy that could really capture the young crowd for NASCAR, the 18 to 30 group that they wanted so badly. And he was ready to do that after the 1986 season. We finished third in points, but that was not to be. And everybody knows the sad story of Tim from that point on. But that's where he made his mark, 1986. And there was a whole lot more.
I mean, we're going to cover this a lot more into this series too, or it's probably going to be what a four part series to say the least. I want to know
Yeah.
what affiliate were you working with in '86?
I was with the Winston Cup team at the
Okay,
time. Yeah.
that's what I wanted to make sure. So, like I said, Steve lived this during back in the day too. So, Steve, I want to start off. Like I said, you've been chronicling these series on the Frontstretch website too. Um, First interesting note is even before the season is that NASCAR announced that they were returning to Watkins Glen. Of course, they raced there a couple times. For the first race in 1957, and then they did
Yeah.
a couple races, including I call the week of Billy Waid. He won 4 straight races within a 9-day period, which is an incredible feat in itself, even back in the day. But Watkins Glen was kind of being used as an F1 track after NASCAR kind of disappeared. Do you think there could have been that possibility of NASCAR and F1 way back in the day being the crossover? A lot of, like I said, there's a lot of that talk now. F1 has made a new Netflix documentary. NASCAR starting to do one similarity with
Right.
U.S. sports. Do you think that crossover could happen and it could have been beneficial to either sport?
But back then couldn't happen because F1 had no use for Southern stock car drivers. Absolutely none. Looked down the nose at them, and so did a lot of the open wheel competitors. NASCAR was called taxi cabs, and its drivers were just taxi cab drivers. That wasn't really racing to these people. So I don't see much of a crossover at all at that time. But the reason NASCAR returned back to Watkins Glen after absence of what, almost 40 years anyway, was this was an era that NASCAR was looking beyond where it had been for so many years. Okay. They had been on road courses before, many of them. The last standing was at Riverside in California at that time. But NASCAR was looking to expand, and the best way to expand at that time, there was no rush to build new speedways like we found in the 90s and later on. There had to go to some existing track. Watkins Glen had a name. Watkins Glen had tradition. Watkins Glen was considered a auto racing mecca. So when the deal came to cross over to NASCAR and let NASCAR race on a road course that had normally been used by F1, they took it. They took it in just a flash. And a lot of people were concerned that NASCAR, and they still you hear this today, doesn't belong on road courses. You're going to hear that argument everywhere you go. But in fact, it does. And they were very anxious to see how the NASCAR drivers and their big, heavy stock cars would do on the track that for so long had been saved for Formula One, an entirely different type of racing. So the concept was interesting, and the interest among NASCAR fans was very high.
Now, Steve, Watkins Glen was the third. It was another road course added to the schedule. They mainly raced at Riverside Speedway for two races. Which drivers were most excited to have another road course on the schedule back in '86?
Well, no doubt about it. It was the guys that had already shown that they could handle a road course very well. They welcomed the opportunity to go to Watkins Glen. Rusty Wallace was one of them, and Terry Labonte was one of them. Ricky Rudd was another. They were accomplished road racing guys, and they enjoyed going to Riverside because they could do so well there. Now, on the other hand, you had several stock car drivers. Man, they didn't want to have anything to do with the road course. And in fact, for years, they hired road course racers to come in and drive their cars at road courses. That happened at Watkins Glen as well. There were some road course names that everybody knew that did not participate in NASCAR, but they came to Watkins Glen and Riverside anyway because some of the stock car drivers just couldn't handle road courses and wanted to get the best effort they could, but it's not going to be on their part.
I guess they had to find new taxi cab drivers, as these
That's
F1
right.
drivers would
That's right.
say. Well, Steve, I want to shift gears here to a little bit of more of the controversy with the series name. Winston Cup was starting to be used in 1986 as the title sponsor, as just simply the NASCAR Winston Cup Series. A lot of the media took fit to that, which is kind
Yeah.
of, it's relatively unheard of in the sports world. You don't see the Major League Baseball or NBA sponsored by their league sponsored by something else. But how much do you think the advertising rule, because there's kind of that rule where you don't want to like
Yeah.
advertise in journalism, how much has
Right.
that changed throughout the years from like '86 to now?
Oh, it's changed dramatically. It's no longer an issue. I mean, I don't see it. I don't think it's an issue whatsoever anymore, especially since newspapers, as you well know, Jerry, are really slowly dying and they're grabbing every dollar they can possibly get. And if that means, calling a circuit the Winston Cup circuit or the Cup circuit or whatever you want to is called, that's going to happen because that's another way to get to that sponsor and see if they can draw some money out of it. But back in '86, ooh, this was not the rule at all. most newspapers and some broadcast outlets didn't like to use the sponsor's name when describing a circuit or a league or whatever it was because they thought it was free advertising. And when NASCAR dropped Grand National, it was no longer Winston Cup Grand National. It's going to be Winston Cup. That set off a lot of newspapers and said, look, we're not going to do this. We're not going to call it Winston Cup because we're not going to give away free advertising. Well, it was a big debate because, number one, what difference does it make? A sponsor, the name of a circuit is the name of the circuit. What are you going to do? If you keep calling it Grand National, that's the name they just gave to the Busch Series. Now you're really confusing people. What are you going to do? And I advanced the argument that, look, when you cover golf, there's a tournament you cover that's called the Kemper Open. Well, you never call it anything else. You call it the Kemper Open. We're journalists. We're supposed to be accurate. And Winston Cup is the name of the circuit. Use it. So they did use it in time, and they found out they didn't suffer, financially from it at all. And I think today that's so much different because no one really cares anymore. And to use the name of the circuit as it is, the Winston Cup, or whatever it is, Winston Cup, Kemper, Barclays Open, Travelers, that's the name of it. And if you're a journalist, you've got to be accurate. Use the name.
Steve, that is pretty interesting that people were up in fits with the name change of dropping the Grand National Series. Understandably, it's confusing when you put when you have your top Cup Series team as Grand National and then you drop it down to the Busch Series. I think that would have been a lot of confusion, but for the namesake it's the NASCAR Winston Cup Series during that time. And like I said, you got to be accurate and you can't confuse the fans. So I find that pretty interesting that people were up in fits in that. Steve, we're going to be shifting gears again to another controversy of age. So Bobby Hillin Jr. won the race at Talladega, and during the broadcast, Ken Squier said that Bobby Hillin was the youngest driver to win a race at Talladega. Do you think that's where the confusion lied, with people thinking that Bobby Hillin Jr. was the youngest driver to ever win a race, or was it something completely different?
Well, no, it was the fact that Ken Squier said it correctly. Bobby Hillin was the youngest driver to win a race at Talladega. Now, at Talladega was left out of a lot of media reports following that race. And it simply said that Bobby Hillin Jr. was the youngest driver to win a NASCAR race. Period. That was not true. Statisticians started looking at NASCAR history and they found two drivers who were younger. Now, Bobby was 22 and a few months when he won. Fireball Roberts won a race, I think it was in Florida, when he was 21 and a few months. And then Donald Thomas, related to NASCAR great Herb Thomas, he won a race in 1950, I think it was, in Atlanta, Georgia. And he was listed as 21 years and fewer. He was younger than Fireball. So there were two of them right there that meant that Bobby Hillin wasn't the youngest driver to win a NASCAR race. He was third youngest driver ever to win one. And that took some research. But the confusion began when it was decreed that he was the youngest to win the Talladega, which is the truth. It's just interpreted a different way and it created some confusion.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of confusion, especially in those early days. You didn't have that fancy timing and scoring that happened that NASCAR could rely on. And I find it another interesting note, too, at the end of the broadcast. The TV said that Phil Parsons finished in 10th place. When he was actually lapped down, he was scored ahead on the TV, ahead of those cars that wrecked out in the last lap, including Bobby Allison, when in reality he finished 13th. Did that thing slip by as well, too? Or do you think that was actually corrected, too? Because that's another thing that, the finish of the race kind of gets mixed up.
Yeah, back in those days, that happened a lot more than you might think. And it was due, I'll just be general about this whole subject. It was due to the NASCAR scoring system. It was done by scorers who literally watched their driver on the track and recorded when he came by and took his lap. Now, you and I both know, Jared, that anything can mess that up. You miss a guy, you score him when you get him, and you cost him a lap. I mean, it's just too much room for human error. And I don't want to say that happened all the time, but it did happen plenty of times during that time. And you couldn't fault the scorers because they were doing the best they could. They were very good at what they did, but they weren't perfect. And this system wasn't perfect. Now, in this modern age of technology, where we have computers and transponders and radios and so forth and so on, that just doesn't happen. I can't remember the last time they had any kind of major scoring controversy. So you have to thank technology for a few things in NASCAR, and that's one of them.
Absolutely. I think back to obviously one of the biggest controversies was a few years after 1986 was the North Wilkesboro race. Did Brett Bodine really win that race, or was it Dale Earnhardt who was leading that race?
That's right.
And
I
I
have a
think,
story about I have a story about that too for you. I was at that race and I was watching it, and for some reason, later in the race, when Brett came in the pit, he'd been running a good race for Kenny Bernstein's team the whole time. Very good race. And he was in contention. And he came in for a pit stop. And I just happened to watch that pit stop. So I want to watch all day. And it was the only one I timed all day. It was a 19-second pit stop back in the age when 22 seconds was a fast one.
oh yeah,
He pulled off a 19-second pit stop. I timed it. So when he came back out, you know, he eventually moved into the lead because others came in the pit behind him and that sort of thing. And they always thought that he could not have ever taken the lead because his competitors always thought there's no way he could be in the lead. And I spoke up and I said, wait a minute, guys, I just timed him down here. He made a pit stop that was 3 seconds faster than anybody else. Of course, he was in the lead. That's exactly why I think that he won the race. Now, everybody can disagree with me, and Lord knows they do. But in my opinion, doing and seeing what I saw proved the case for me.
that is a pretty interesting tidbit too about scoring. Steve, it is a pleasure to have you on this show. Like I said, we'll have you next time to talk about the second race of the season, how dramatic that was. So I hope everyone sticks around here. Everyone here from Frontstretch, make sure to subscribe and like our content. It helps us, produce more content like this. And wherever you're at, make sure to have a great race weekend. Jared Haas with Frontstretch.com. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, check one of those two videos out that we have right beside you. Visit Frontstretch.com for more great content.